Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Gonzalez,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Gonzalez, and on behalf of the biology department at South Texas College, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. We have a great presentation. I'm about to introduce our speaker, but before we do, I would like to ask that you subscribe to our channel. We're trying to grow our channel, so if you could subscribe and share with it with as many people as you can. Some of your instructors have asked that you ask questions, so feel free to ask questions in the comment box. We will be gathering the questions and then we will present those the last 30 minutes of our time. Also, if you could please be respectful in the comments and just be polite as much as you can. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So Dr. Gabler, he leads the Plant Ecology and Sustainability Lab at UTRGV, whose work focuses on global change and finding practical ways to reverse the current rapid decline in biodiversity and ecosystem function. He received his PhD from Rice University in 2012 and held postdoctoral positions at the University of Houston and the USGS National Wetlands Research Center. He joined the faculty at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley in 2016, where he is currently an assistant professor in the School of Earth, Environmental, and Marine Sciences with a joint appointment in the Department of Biology. He is also the program coordinator for UTRGV's Bachelor's of Science program in Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems. Dr. Gabler's research focuses mainly on ecological restoration, climate change, invasive species, and sustainable agriculture. He works most frequently in coastal habitats, wetlands, forests, and urban agroecosystems. The title of our presentation today is Impacts of Climate Change in the Lower Rio Grande Valley and What We Can Do About It. Dr. Gabler will explore some of the key ecological, economic, and social impacts of climate change on the people and ecosystems of the U.S. Gulf Coast, with a focus on the Lower Rio Grande Valley. He will also discuss some of the most important ways that we can act to reduce our personal and collective carbon footprints and otherwise act to help mitigate climate change in the coming decades. And without further ado, here is Dr. Chris Gabler.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm actually in one of my urban agroecosystems right now. I'm on my deck, and this is where we're starting seeds. That's what these trays are behind me, where we're starting seeds for our native plant nursery to regrow Tamaulipan thorn scrub forest species. So let me share my screen here, and that also means that you might hear birds and wind. So if the wildlife gets too noisy, just let me know. I'm going to share my presentation now. Okay. Someone tell me if this isn't displaying right, but you should be seeing the presentation here. So thank you, Elizabeth. I've gotten to know Elizabeth several ways recently. We've been doing some political outreach together lately. I'm really excited to be friends with her and to get this chance to talk today. So thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present and discuss these important issues, which are important not just to us as citizens of the world, because this truly is a global crisis. Climate change truly is of dire global importance, but also as citizens of the Rio Grande Valley, right? And as I'm going to show you, our region is particularly sensitive to climate change. And compared to a lot of other regions, most other regions in the world, the people and the wildlife of the Rio Grande Valley are going to feel more impacts of climate change and feel those impacts more strongly, and they're going to have a greater effect on our economy and society, our local environment than most other parts of the world. Okay, so I'll start. Oops, there we go. So tonight I'll be discussing I'll begin with the big picture of climate change. So what is that exactly is changing, and what are the impacts of those changes likely to be? Most of these things are going to be stuff you've heard before, like greater temperatures and differences in rainfall, that kind of thing. But I'm going to go into more scientific detail than you've ever heard on any kind of news or a political debate. So that's going to allow you to get a better understanding, a deeper understanding of what these phenomenon are and how they're connected to everything else, because that's really important. After that, I'll just go on to discuss our region specifically. We're going to zoom in on the Rio Grande Valley. And like I said, I'm going to show you why we're particularly sensitive to climate change here in the region. And I've got to say, I'm going to sort of zoom in on the RGV multiple times. You know, as in later sections, I'll always be referring back to kind of what does this mean locally, okay? So then after we talk a little bit about RGV specific issues, I'm going to get out of my area of expertise and just spend a little bit of time talking about just scratching the surface of some of the economic and social implications of climate change. And I'm an ecologist, I'm a STEM scientist, so this is not my specialty, but the economy and society are fundamentally connected to the environment. And I'll say that again, the economy and society are fundamentally connected to the environment. And so the human impacts of changes in climate are very well understood, and they're very well studied, as a matter of fact. And so this information I'm going to be showing you is not my own research. It's information from people who are experts in sociology and economics and related fields. Okay, so after that, we'll get back into the heart of my comfort zone. We're going to look at coastal wetlands as a case study, okay? And hopefully everyone can see my mouse here. Oops, jumping the gun there, reached one of my first punchlines. Coastal wetlands are a really good case study. I like to be able to share my own personal research on this subject. And so I'm going to cover about 8 years of research in about 8 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, because I think I've got a little bit more time than I thought. And they're a really good example because they are directly impacted by climate change in a lot of interesting ways. And how those ecological impacts translate to impacts on people and the economy are actually very clear and straightforward with wetlands. So they're a great case study. And then we'll sort of wrap up. We'll conclude this talk by taking at least 20 minutes to discuss what we can do about all this, right? Things we can do today and tomorrow and for the next years to come. And there are going to be some surprises in this section, right? I think some of the things we talk about are not going to be what you expect to hear in this part. And that's a good thing, right? There's a lot of misinformation out there. And I cannot overemphasize in this last section how important it is that this solution to this problem is going to require big changes in our personal behavior and deep shifts in how we do things collectively as a society. Okay, that's not easy. So we'll look at some of the biggest factors that drive our own personal carbon footprints, and we're going to look at how to reduce those. And then we'll examine some larger social constructs. We're just kind of, this is sort of the farthest from my area of expertise. So we're going to discuss this more abstractly, but we do need to talk about it. These large social constructs like governments and corporations, and how the role, not only the role they play, but how they're driving climate change, and very importantly, how they are controlling the way that you and I and our societies can even begin to respond to climate change. Okay, so first things first, climate change is most definitely real, and humans are the cause. Now, at this point, these two hard truths are really not up for debate. And anyone who says otherwise, they're either misinformed, and I will tell you now, misinformation is a very big and very important problem, or they are not arguing in good faith. They're arguing in bad faith. That is, they're intentionally misleading you for political or economic reasons, or both. The science behind climate change is crystal clear. And yes, scientists do debate climate change. That doesn't mean it isn't real, okay? Debate is a normal and important part of science itself. But this debate is over finer points, subtleties in what's happening, right? So is this ice cap going to take 15 or 20 years to melt, and why one or the other? Not, is the ice cap melting in the first place, and not, are humans the reason it's melting, okay? The collective body of evidence leaves no uncertainty that climate change is real and humans are the cause. Now, if you believe otherwise, I'm happy to discuss this with you, but there's really not room in this presentation to go down a rabbit hole of false narrative, okay? So we are here today to talk about and start fixing this problem, and we really don't have any time to waste. So let's begin. So big picture, what is it that's actually changing? So I want to start this part by pointing out that climate change is not a distant theoretical threat. It's here now. It's already happening. We've been seeing its effects for decades now, and it will get worse, all right? Where we are now, what we know is working, how we know these climate systems operate, if we stopped polluting today, and I don't mean cut our emissions to net zero, I mean didn't put another gram of carbon in the atmosphere, we would still see impacts of climate change and things would still get worse for a while because this ship is moving and it has so much inertia. It's going to take time for these things to settle out and slow down. So the critical question then is how much worse is it actually going to get? And that is what this is all about. That is what we can change and do right now. Our actions will decide. Our actions today and for the next decades are going to decide how bad it actually gets. Okay, so one bit of technical thing before I get into the next slides. And I've got to say, so I'm going to give you a lot of data. I'm going to show you a lot of graphs. I'm going to show you information straight from the horse's mouth, one of the best sources on climate change information, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. And we're not going to get too deep into the subtleties. I'm going to sort of cover big picture, main take-home points from some graphs that are pretty complex, okay? But I'm going to walk you through them and make sure we're keeping on track and keeping our eyes on the prize and focusing on the key points here. But a lot of the things that are on there that are important have to do with these RCPs, which stand for representative concentration pathway. So this is sort of like scenarios. And in the prior International Panel on Climate Change report, they called them emission scenarios. And that's what these are, okay? And they had different names. Now they give them numbers associated with different amounts of emissions. And they basically correspond to low, medium, and high emission scenarios. Okay, so RCP 2.6 is the lowest scenario, and it's very stringent, very ambitious. In order for us to be on this pathway, we have to make major reductions right away, early on. And we have to really start cutting them in a major way by 2020. Oops, didn't do that. And in theory, we would reach zero emissions by 2100. That's not looking great, okay? That's the best case scenario, right? So we're not super likely to meet that at this point, but who knows? We can change a lot. RCP 4.5 is the sort of low intermediate one. This suggests that emissions are going to peak by around 2040, okay? Because let me tell you, we're not even cutting emissions at this point. We're still growing in terms of how much carbon we put in the atmosphere every year. We're not at the point of reducing our emissions yet. We're talking about slowing down how fast they go up. So this is saying that by 2040, we peak. We hit that top emission amount as more and more countries develop and they get wealthier and have bigger carbon footprints. So, but by 2040, it peaks and then it starts to decline. RCP 6.0 is the high intermediate one that basically says the same thing, except peak happens in 2080. And then RCP 8.5 is the high scenario. This is the sort of most pessimistic one. This is the business as usual model where emissions continue to rise through the end of this century. And we have some reason to think that could be the way things go. Okay, so here's a super important slide. This is the summary of this entire first section. So these are the key changes we expect to see in our global climate in the next 100 years, or I should say by the end of this century, by 2100. And we'll talk about some that go further on. But right now we're just kind of thinking about this 1 century timescale. So the first is increased temperature. You know, people used to call climate change global warming because of this. And that is a huge, huge part of climate change, but it's not the only part, all right? But this is the part that is by probably the least refutable and most crystal clear of all the different things, is that temperatures have been going up, and they're going to go up another 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, and higher than 4 degrees Celsius in some parts of the world. The warming is not going to be uniform across our planet. We're also going to see some very significant and important changes in precipitation. And this is kind of the most complex pattern, because global water cycles are complex and nuanced. It has a lot to do with geography. It has a lot to do with biology. It's messy and complicated. So one of the best ways to kind of generalize what we expect to see, and this is an oversimplification, but there's a lot of truth to saying that the places that are already kind of wet are going to get wetter, which is not always a good thing. That brings flooding and all sorts of other issues. Dry areas are likely to get drier. That's obviously a bad thing for places that are water stressed. And if you're trying to grow crops in an already arid part of the world, like the Rio Grande Valley. And there's going to be more volatility. So it's less predictable. You're going to have more unseasonal weather at different seasons. You're going to have more spans with no rain, and then spans where we get too much rain. And in general, when we see precipitation, whether it's rain or snow, we're likely to see it in fewer, larger storms, okay? So even if some place has the same amount of rainfall, they will get it, instead of having, 80 rainfall events over the course of a year, it'll be 40, and they'll be bigger, okay? And that has a lot to do with where that water actually goes. So the third big change that we expect globally is sea level rise. And this is a result of warming, which melts polar ice caps, and warming, which makes water bigger. You heat something up and it increases in volume. And so those things combined, and various other things, including subsidence, mean that we have this global rise in sea level that's going to be somewhere between 40 and 80 centimeters, or about 1.5 to 2.5 feet by the end of this century. Those of you who have been around the coast and here in the Rio Grande Valley, hopefully that's everybody, just imagine standing on South Padre Island and what it would look like if the water was 2.5 feet higher. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to show you images of what that might look like, okay? The fourth key change to the global climate that we expect in the coming century is more intense storms. So specifically, I'm talking like really big storms, like tropical cyclones, hurricanes, even things like polar vortices. We're not expecting to see more storms necessarily, but we are expecting to see more of the storms that we have be severe, okay? Total number of hurricanes probably won't change. The number of category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes, all the models agree we're going to go up. We're going to see more of those storms, which are the ones that really put the hurt on coastal ecosystems. We're also going to see more extreme weather events, things like more heat waves and droughts, longer heat waves and droughts, and we're going to see combined events. And if you have a drought and a heat wave at the same time, which usually happens, and one can trigger the other, they can compound themselves because you have no evaporative cooling. And so droughts can make heat waves absolutely dire. We're going to see more of that. Okay, so let's look at some pictures. This first image is not what we think is going to happen in the future. This is what has already happened. So when I say we're already experiencing climate change, this is what I'm talking about. So this top left is looking at the average temperature over the last 160 years or so. And we see that it was wiggly. Where's my mouse? There we go. You can see this, right? Can someone tell me if you can see the mouse? In theory, you do, but I always like to check.
Yes.
Great. Okay. And so it wiggles because there's decadal patterns. There's El Nino and La Nina. There's just variability, but it's varying within a normal range. Okay. But then after about 1900, when the Industrial Revolution really began to kick off, it starts to go up. And then when human population started to get into the 5, 6, 7, 8 billion people, we're not at 8 yet, but we will be soon. When population really started to take off, so do emissions, okay? And this is when we also see increases in temperature. And I'm going to show you this explicitly in a slide, but I'm just saying this is what we're already seeing. And we can look at this by decadal averages as well, same pattern. we can look at sea ice extent, and we see, not surprisingly, that as temperatures go up, the amount of sea ice we have goes down, which is very important for climate change. I mean, for sea level rise, and pretty important if you're something like a polar bear that needs to live on the sea ice. And we also see, connected obviously to both temperature rise and sea ice extent going down, is global average sea level, which has been going up very clearly for the last 110 years. Okay, and so again, these differences are region specific. So the figures on the bottom kind of show changes we've already seen in surface temperature in roughly the last 100 years, and how some areas are heating up faster than others. And we also have already seen a lot of changes in precipitation. Some areas are getting 20, 50, 100 millimeters more rainfall than others. Others are going down that much. That's a lot of rain. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa and you're getting 50 or 100 millimeters of rainfall less, that could be the difference between whether you can grow food or not. And that's pretty important. All right, so like I mentioned on the last slide, and I feel compelled to mention the linkage every time I talk about this, but here are the images that show this link. What we've seen in terms of temperature rise and how it's connected to human activity, right? So the two on the left are the same things we saw before. We see this is the same increase in temperature and the same increase in sea level. And this is put in direct comparison to the global average greenhouse gas concentrations, right? You may think like, who was measuring carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere in 1850? Well, nobody was, but ice was forming in those years, and there's a lot of gaps in ice which have samples of the atmosphere from those times. And we have lots of really good, really reliable ways that we can look at these things and see exactly and measure. You know, we can date the ice reliably a lot of different ways, and we can then tell how much CO2 is in, and methane and nitrous oxide are in those things. Okay, so we can very reliably measure that for this chronosequence. In fact, we can go back a lot further. And what we see is that these carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide emissions track pretty closely, very compellingly closely, human activity and human population and temperature increases, right? So the bottom right is this global anthropogenic CO2 emissions. This isn't us looking at the atmosphere and wondering where the CO2 came from. This is us measuring what we've actually emitted, and we know. And we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere and tell, based on its carbon isotope ratio, where it came from. Because carbon respired from a plant is different from carbon that is burned when you combust a fossil fuel. The carbon isotope ratios are different. We can tell by looking at the atmosphere and a sample of air, we can tell where this carbon is coming from. Okay, so and there's math to this, but it's very well established. It's physical science. It's not really anything that's debated. We can be sure of this. Okay, so there's a link between, as the top two show, temperature and these greenhouse gas concentrations. Again, that's physical science. That's really not debated. And there's a link between both of these things and human population, as well as human carbon emissions, which we can track very reliably. So hopefully I don't need to like convince anybody else of this link, but it's always good to cover our bases and to show people it, you know, if you're out there talking to people who are doubting climate change, you can be confident there's there are tomes and tomes of data and information and evidence to validate this linkage. All right. And one thing a lot of climate deniers will point out is, well, what about all these other natural processes? And they say, oh, how can humans have so much hubris to think that we can manipulate the environment? Well, I've got to say, the lowliest worm manipulates their environment. That's why we like earthworms in our garden, because everything changes its environment. And one human doesn't have a huge impact, but 7.5 billion humans most certainly do. So this is showing, the black bar is our observed warming. And this is just the last 60 years, roughly. Okay, and we saw that in that 60 years, we went up about 0.7 degrees Celsius. And we can figure out, based on our understanding of atmospheric chemistry and physics and a lot of other things, what is actually driving these differences. And we know that the greenhouse gas emissions that we can measure are very responsible for this. There are other things that people do that reduce warming, but if you combine these anthropogenic factors, it's overwhelmingly positive. And what do you know? It's just like how much warming we've seen in the last 60 years. Natural forcings is really interesting and important to talk about because people will say, what about volcanoes? Yeah, they emit carbon dioxide and methane and sulfates and all sorts of different things and nitrous oxide. And what about solar flares? You know what? Those things might be driving our change in climate. Well, the thing is that we can measure those. We can very carefully attribute specific changes in the climate to those. We know how much a solar flare affects the climate. We know how much a volcano affects the climate. And their impact is this, basically zero in the last 60 years compared to what human impact has done. All right, and this last one, natural internal variability, is just the chaos, the stochasticity of these complex systems. The global climate system is a very complex thing, and we expect to see variability from this, you know, but we don't expect to see anywhere near the level of variability that we've observed. It only makes sense if you consider the role humans have played. Okay, so specifically now, that was all what's already happened. What have we seen in the last 50, 60, 100 years to show that climate change is here and now and already affecting us? So now let's turn and let's look forward. Let's look into the future. And let's start with temperature, which is the one of the things that all of the models agree on the most. And if you look here, are those RCPs, those representative concentration pathways I told you about. And the top part is looking at mean surface temperature change. So how much the temperature is going to go up. And then this bottom set is sea level rise. And you can see that there are those low, medium, and high concentration scenarios by these different RCPs. And the mean increase of these different scenarios ranges from about 1 to 2. But the likely range for these is, I'm sorry, that's for the to take us to the middle of this century, right? So 1 to 2 degrees increased by 2046, 2065, but by this end of the century, we expect these increases to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, like I mentioned in the slides a few slides ago. And this could be a broader range. Remember, these are means of a projected average, or means of a projected range. And I'll show you why we refer to it that way by showing you some of the illustrations of the actual models. So some more of these numbers are going to make sense to you. But it's safe to say 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. Those are very good and likely predictions. And as far as climate models go, we don't talk about models unless we can rely on them to some degree. But these are some of the most reliable and most trustworthy models, especially because you can, look backwards and say, well, now that we've gotten 15 years of data, we can test our model and we can sort of say, if we were in 2020 and we applied our same models to what we had seen in the last 50 and 100 years, let's see what it says climate's going to do from 2020 to 2000 to 2020. And what do you know? They do a fabulous job of predicting what actually happened. So for lots of reasons, we trust these models. All right, so sea level rise again, by the end of the century, looking to be in the range of 40, the averages 40 to 60 centimeters. Some of these are looking higher and could easily reach 80 centimeters, right? So 1.5 to 2.5 feet. Okay, so here's why we have these ranges. So this is looking at the projections, and this is a model running its course and making predictions year after year after year based on all the different things that are connected in how our climate works. And we see that for RCP 2.6, the really optimistic one, remember, emissions peak early and then they don't go up anymore. So not surprisingly, climate warms a little bit and then it stops warming and it kind of stays the same for the last half of the century. But if you're one of the later emission scenarios, like business as usual, where emissions continue on to the end of the century, it can grow and grow and grow. And these models, the reason there's this wiggle, there's this band around this line, is because they're actually, we talk about these models. So one of these lines is actually the output of 46 different models being run by government supercomputers all over the world. Okay, that's if you've ever heard of CMIP, the coupled modeling. I don't remember what CMIP stands for. It'll come to me. It was on the tip of my tongue. I was looking at the website earlier today. I don't remember, but I'll look it up before the end of this talk. These are, like the US Department of Energy's model, the European Space Agency's climate model, run on these multi-million-dollar supercomputers. And this band is the wiggle of 46 models making predictions about what's going to happen to our climate. So, that's also why the bands are narrower, closer to the present time, and wider as you get further out, because there's more stochasticity in where these models take you. And so this range is kind of the upper and lower bounds of what these models are predicting. All right. So that's why we say we think under RCP 8.5, temperature rise is going to be about 4 degrees Celsius, but it could be as high as 4.8 or as low as 2, that kind of thing. Okay. Because we don't necessarily know which of these models is doing the best job of predicting it. But when we look at what's called the ensemble, all of these models put together, they agree a ton. Right. So trusting the ensemble predictions has been smart to date. Okay. We have no reason to think they're going to start being bad in the future. Okay. And so similarly with sea level rise, same kind of scenario. They're going to start increasing more rapidly as we get into the later part of the century. And again, these projections are different around the world. Some areas are going to get hotter, and other areas won't increase in temperature quite as much. The land warms up faster than the water, and the poles are heating up more quickly than lower latitudes. And so you can see, even though there's this 2 to 4 degree increase, there are parts of the world that are going up 10 Celsius. That is incredibly much. My goodness. Okay, let me put this in a bigger context. So we talk about a 4 degrees Celsius change, and maybe you appreciate how big that is. But let me tell you this, when our climate was the average temperature, when the average temperature was 4 degrees colder than it is now, Boston was under a glacier, under 40 feet of ice in Boston. Okay, so that's what 4 degrees colder compared to now will do to our climate. So just imagine what 4 degrees warmer can do to a climate. Now imagine what 10 degrees warmer does to a climate. This is a big deal. These are not subtle changes. These are very serious changes. Thank you, Jorge. So CMIP is the coupled model intercomparison project. So reflecting the fact that there's a bunch of models out there and they work together, and there's value and important information to be gained by matching them up and looking at how they agree and disagree. Okay, thanks, Jorge. I was going to drive me crazy. I'm so glad you told me that. Okay. All right, so now let's look at rainfall. And I should say precipitation, because it's not just rainfall, it's also snowfall. Okay, and sleet and all the other things that come out of the sky. Water coming from the atmosphere. And you'll notice here that it's like temperature, it's very patchy. Some areas are getting wetter, some areas are getting drier. And I've got to say, it's actually a lot more nuanced than this. If you zoom in and you look at particular regions, it can be a lot more complicated. And this is also exacerbated by the fact of like rivers and streams, right? And how surface water flows and where it goes and what groundwater is doing, yada, yada, yada. So water is complicated. Our water cycle is nuanced and subtle and a difficult thing to model. But again, there's a lot of wisdom to saying the wet areas are going to get wetter and the dry areas are going to get drier. And it's really important to note that rainfall matters all the time, but there are certain seasons when rainfall has different effects. So rainfall in the growing season is very important to agriculture, for example. Snowfall over the winter is very important for actually having fresh water come spring when snow melts. So these differences, and that's one of the beauties of these models, is that they don't just tell us kind of on from year to year what's happening. It's looking at it day to day over the course of the seasons, and we can make season specific projections. So there's a lot of subtle nuances here. And what I really want to point out by showing you this again is just that it's area specific and it's season specific, and the timing of things in a lot of ways for precipitation is as important as the amount. Okay, so looking at more models, again, this is a ton of information. We don't need to get bogged down in the details here, but I'm showing you this to demonstrate that we're also going to see big changes in evaporation, and it's going to be spatially variable. We're going to see differences in the delta EP, right? The difference between how much water evaporates and how much water precipitates. So the total water balance, the delta value. We're going to see differences in runoff. We're going to see differences in soil moisture. This is generally bad news because even with the same amount of rain, it's warmer, more evaporation, soil moisture typically going down. Again, bad for agriculture. And if you look at North America, those are not good numbers. You don't like to see that much of a percentage decrease in soil moisture. Okay, that is not good for the Midwest. It's not good for our food production. And it's definitely not good for the Southwest, which is already aching for water. Specific humidity is pretty much going to go up everywhere. That's because warm air holds more water. Which is a big part of why rainfall events are going to do what we think they're going to do. And there are going to be big changes in relative humidity, not just specific humidity. And again, that is going to be more spatially specific. Well, here's a few more of these projections for different models and these are looking at kind of extremes. So the number of warm days, the number of cold days, and this is sort of defined as a regionally, particularly the hot or cold time, which is sort of a one metric for severe weather events. Okay, but the reason I included this here in the precipitation section is to show you this metric of very wet days, i.e., when you might expect a flood. So we're talking about having 15-ish days of heavy rains that might keep you from getting to work on time every year because of unusual rainfall versus 50 days a year. Think about that. Just think about how much, even if rain it's not a hurricane and it's causing you problems, just think about the disruption of not being able to drive 50 days out of the year because of severe rain. Obviously, it's not going to happen that way in every part of the world, but some of the more subtle findings of climate change have very, very profound implications for how we operate as people and how our businesses run and how our communities function. All right, next I want to tell you about sea level rise. And I've included this handy illustration of the average human size on the right here to show where some of these means are. And this is the same values. These are the same values we talked about before, sort of 40 to 60-ish, maybe as high as 80 centimeters of sea level rise by the end of this century, okay, by 2100. Now, there's a lot of information going on this sheet. So basically, the crosses at the bottom are individual contributions from this list of things at the top here, okay? So sea level is going to go up because of thermal expansion, right? I mentioned to you before that warm water takes up more space, it expands. So just surface temperatures rising makes sea level go up. Glaciers are going to melt, the Greenland ice sheet is going to melt, Antarctic ice is going to melt. We're going to have some water being stored on land. We're going to have, and then some dynamics of these ice sheets, okay, that might be more, might be less. And if you put those things all together, you get the sum, which are these gray boxes. The bar is the average, and the tops and bottoms are your sort of confidence interval of where this might be, okay? So if you add up all the high points of these crosses at the bottom, you'll get the top of the box. The bottom point is the bottom, and the crosshash in the middle is the black bar here on these gray boxes. And then I've converted these average predictions to these lines over here. This darker line, that darker, thicker red line is the overall average. So again, we're talking 1.5 to 2.5 feet. And hopefully this is sinking in, no pun intended, but I should have intended it. Hopefully this is sinking into you of how big of a change this is. And maybe you're saying, okay, well, I'll just go up land. I don't need, if I'm not going to drown in this sea level rise because it's only up to my waist. Well, I include that our little four-legged friend here, this beagle in his snorkeling outfit, to demonstrate that and remind you that we aren't the only species on the planet. There are a lot more living things that are important in their own right and important to us in one way or another that we also need to think about. Not all of these things can migrate. Not all these things can walk up land, can get in a car and drive to a higher area. Sea level rise of this magnitude is a really big deal. And this is just the next 80 years. If we look further to 2,500, right? So we're looking almost 500 years into the future. And these models go that far. Right? We can project that far into the future. We see that over that kind of time frame, let's really hope these are low emission scenarios. I mentioned Boston being under 40 feet of ice. Well, Port Isabel could be under 40 feet of water. These are big changes. So if we manage to keep carbon dioxide concentrations under 500, and they aren't really looking like we're going to keep to that trend, then by 2,500, we will probably see a meter or less of sea level rise. If we're in these medium range scenarios where we're somewhere between 500 and 700 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, then we could see over 2 meters of sea level rise. And if we're in a high range, over 700 parts per million, then yeah, 5, 6, 7 meters. 7 meters, it's 25 feet. Okay, so maybe not 40 feet of water in Port Isabel, but that's a lot of water. Okay. And again, this is showing you sort of the contributions from different sources of sea level rise. And then the red bar is the total there. Okay. All right. Now, one of the most important things to think about when we talk about sea level rise, a lot of the flooding that happens that can devastate homes and businesses and livelihoods and farms and wildlife and habitat, et cetera, isn't because of just the sea level going up. It's because of a storm, of a flood, a hurricane, a storm surge, something like that. And what this image is showing you are I left the caption in here. This is the estimated multiplication factor. Okay, and it showed at each of these tide gauges based on the color, by which the frequency of flooding events for a given height increase is going to be expected, right? So in the top part, A, this is based on just a mean sea level rise of 50 centimeters, 5 meters, okay? And B, the bottom one, which is pretty similar, is based on the actual sea level rise projections for the RCP 4.5 scenario, the intermediate low scenario, okay? So let's look at this. So with the intermediate low scenario, the dot here that's closest to the Rio Grande Valley is this turquoise looking dot, which is probably Houston, okay? So that's turquoise. That's somewhere between 10, and notice this is a logarithmic scale, all right? Beware, be warned, be afraid of the log scale here. So that turquoise color is probably in the neighborhood of 20 or so, maybe 15, 20, but still more than 10. More than 10 times the risk of flooding for the projected increase, okay? So let's think about that. Even if it's 10. So you know those 100-year floods that we think about when we're buying a house or getting flood insurance? These rare storms that in a given year you think you have about a 1% chance of experiencing. And you know how lately we've had, 4 or 5 of them in the last 2 decades, a lot more than one a century. Well, this is saying that those 100-year floods are going to be 10 times more common. So your 100-year flood is going to happen every 10 years instead of every 100 years. Or really, the statistics of this say that you're going to be getting them, you have a 10% chance of a 100-year flood every year. That's what that statistic really means. That's pretty scary. And what's really scary are the people in the deep red. These are those island nations that are absolutely in dire straits because of sea level rise. These are countries and cultures and people that are being literally wiped off the map by sea level rise. Okay, I need to move on because even though I have a good amount of time to talk, I've got a lot to cover here. So another thing to think about when we talk about sea level rise is what happens to all the things that live on the coast. I mentioned that we can get in a car and drive away unless it gets flooded. Sorry, that's not a bird, that's an airplane. We can, unless we're in this car that got flooded, we could drive and go somewhere else. But what about the birds and fish and animals and things, the things that live in the mud on the wetland? You know, where can they go? What about the plants themselves that make this wetland habitat? Where do they go? Can they migrate? Sometimes, if it happens slowly enough, and they can naturally disperse along with the changing tide line. But there are also barriers to migration. Houses, like in this image, roads, you name it. So the wildlife often doesn't even have a fighting chance when it comes to adapting to sea level rise. This whole notion of, well, expecting nature to adapt or to survive, we have really handicapped their ability to do that. All right, another big part of climate change is storms, and I'm going to speed up because I'm already sort of half-ish way through the time I want to spend talking. This is a lot of data, but the take-home point here is that the frequency of storms is pretty variable. And in the last 100 years, we've seen really active years and quiet years, and we've seen what looks like some trends. But if we really do good stats on this, there's no reason to suspect, there's no reason to reject the null hypothesis that the number of storms we're seeing is higher than it was 100 years ago. Okay, here's another way of looking at this, and it's the same kind of thing. You know, like we see what looks like an upward trend, but it's been volatile, and 100 years ago, we saw a lot of storms too. And so really, the past observations and our current predictive models actually agree that we're probably not going to see a difference in the total number of tropical cyclones. So tropical storms, hurricanes, you know, and of course, like the southern and eastern hemisphere equivalents. However, and this is really important, they do agree that we're going to see an increase in the number of severe storms. That is, we're going to see more categories 3, 4, and 5 storms. That's a really big deal. Like I mentioned before, part of the reason this is so important is because it's the severe storms that really have big and lasting impacts. I've lived on the Gulf Coast my entire life, and I've been through my share of hurricanes. I lived in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit. I've luckily got out and got to Houston in time, but a lot of my neighbors didn't. And the thing is, New Orleans had gotten through dozens of category 1s and tropical storms and was really no worse for the wear. But one big storm, and it's devastated for years. And there are parts of New Orleans that are still recovering, right? And the recent hurricane we saw, I think it was category 3 at landfall, and we had massive damage in Edinburgh. These are the storms we need to worry about, and they're the ones that we're going to see more of. So added to that, on average, hurricanes and other major cyclonic storms are going to have faster wind speeds on average. They're going to produce more rainfall, and they're going to generate higher storm surges. So more power to blow down your house and knock things over, more rainfall to flood you, and more storm surge to inundate coastal areas. That's a big deal. And of course, this is on top of sea level rise. So category 3 coming through the Houston Ship Channel, versus category 3 coming through the Houston Ship Channel when the water is 2.5 feet higher. Different game. So remind you of this figure. Now, 100 times greater flood risk makes a lot of sense. All right, we've already talked about these impacts, and it hopefully I've got your imagination flowing, and you've started to envision what some of the impacts are going to be from bigger storms and hotter temperatures and changing rainfall and all of that. But let's name a few of these explicitly. And I want to point out first that these impacts, there are a lot of them. There are many impacts, and they're diverse. There's a lot of stuff that's unexpected, and they're complicated. All right. You know, the nature of a change is, like I talked about water and the water cycle. The effects on water availability is very complex, and it interacts with all the other things. It interacts with rain. The precipitation is interacting with temperature because of precipitation and how much water is in the atmosphere, how much water the atmosphere can hold, and it's interacting with storm events, etc. Another really important truth for the impacts, and this has kind of been true for all of human history, is that they disproportionately affect the poor. The wealthy are much more insulated from the impacts of climate change because they don't live in those poor houses near the water without good flood protection. And they can move, and they can run their air conditioner, and so on. And I was having a conversation Monday with some colleagues at a seminar, and we were talking about how, you know, this is obviously not helping anybody. Climate change hurts everybody. So it's in the wealthy's interest to do something about it because it's going to hurt their bottom line. But why? But maybe they don't think so. Maybe they're so confident that they're insulated from this that they don't really feel the urgency. Okay, so like I mentioned to you with the changes we expect to see, and I pointed out that climate change is already happening, I want to begin this section by saying we're already feeling the impacts. We're already paying in dollars and cents for climate change. You and me, every day, we are paying more money because of climate change. We are paying for this in terms of health impacts. People are dying. You know, I'm convinced that the polar vortex that knocked out power in Texas, that severe storm was the kind of big storm we expect to see more of because of climate change. People died because of that. People die every time there's a bad heat wave. Or we are paying for this with our health. And we're paying for this financially by higher health insurance rates and higher property insurance rates. Every actuarian in the world knows that climate change is a big deal. Every insurance company is very familiar with the risks of climate change. It's their business to be that way. And you know what? Your health and your property insurance have gone up because of climate change, and they will go up more. But they've already gone up. That's my point here. Okay. And we pay for it when we buy gas. We pay for it when we pay our water bill. We pay for it when we go to the grocery store. We pay for it when we buy a t-shirt, because that cotton came from a place that was affected by climate change, and shipping it around was affected by climate change. Now, a lot of you may be saying, well, gas is as cheap today as it was before. Well, not really. And a lot of these things are buffered by government subsidies. The government intentionally manipulates the price in various ways to keep these things from fluctuating wildly and going up too fast and creating unrest and causing disruptions to our economies. But there are limits to their ability to do this. And where does that government's money come from? It's our tax dollars. We're paying for it one way or the other. Okay, this is a very good summary of region-specific key risks. And I'm not even going to get into the second part of this, the potential risk reductions, because this is, I could spend an hour looking at this one slide, and I'm already approaching 6 o'clock. So I'm going to speed up a fair bit here. So just looking at some of these key impacts. In North America, we're expecting increased risks, increased damages from wildfire, more heat-related human mortality, increased damages from river and coastal urban floods. And I encourage you all, you can easily find, if you just search for IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, there are free, fabulous PDFs that you can get from the IPCC website. It's kind of dense, but read the summary for policymakers. It is 100% worth the read. And it can be hard to distinguish, but I encourage you to try. Ask me questions. I'll tell you about it. So these hashed lines are how much we can change them if we take steps to fix it. All right, so in Central and South America, we're going to see reduced water availability and increased flooding and landslides, reduced food production and reduced food quality, and an increase in the spread of vector-borne diseases. And all over the world, the same kinds of things. Very serious stuff, some of it big risk. And sometimes there's not much we can do to mitigate these risks. We're just gonna have to deal with it if climate changes. So we need to be sure, we need to take real action to mitigate climate change. So in the interest of speeding up here, this is looking at changes in catch, right? So fisheries yield, that's very important for feeding ourselves, and for lots of important economies around the world rely on fisheries. And this is looking at shellfish in particular that are affected not so much by temperature, but by ocean acidification and higher pH, right? So mollusks can't form their skeletons when the water is too acidic. It becomes too costly, and the calcium ions don't go together the same way. And so we're expecting to see, this is showing a lot of places where it's getting worse for fisheries yield, some places where it's getting better. This is showing places where we're mostly seeing decreases or no change for mollusks, crustaceans, and different types of corals. And if you kind of put this all together, you may think, well, winners and losers. I'll eat lobster instead of tuna. Okay, not really, because the benefits are wildly outweighed by the costs. The decreases are much bigger than the increases. This is not, there are going to be a few species that benefit. There are going to be some winners, but they're going to be mostly losers. Overall, far worse. All right, here's another really fantastic diagram figure from the IPCC's fifth assessment report. And I'm just going to briefly kind of talk to you about some of the key risks they identify, right? These big impacts. So reductions in the terrestrial carbon sink, like our land's ability to store carbon. And you may think, okay, well, I can't grow food and I'm dying of heat stroke. Why do I care about how much carbon the land is storing? Because it can get worse. So this second one, and here are two things related to that. The bottom one is the Amazon tipping point. So if the Amazon gets too arid, it shifts to a far less carbon dense world. And the rainforest is no longer full of big trees. It's patchy. It's more savanna-like. So there's a lot less carbon there. And all the carbon in those trees goes into the atmosphere. And a lot of the biodiversity goes with it. But the one that keeps me up at night, the one that scares me, like as a scientist, scares me, is this boreal tipping point. So this is the idea, and if you don't know this, there are gigatons of carbon, of peat, dead, old plant matter, underground, but not very deep underground, frozen. It's frozen. And because it's frozen is the only reason it doesn't decompose and turn into carbon dioxide. So if we get too warm, that permafrost, that frozen carbon starts to melt, it starts to decompose, and it goes into the atmosphere, which increases the carbon dioxide concentration, which increases heating, which makes the temperature go up, which makes more permafrost melt, which makes more carbon decompose. You see where I'm going with this? It is a positive feedback loop is the term, even though the consequences are very negative, obviously, but it means it's self-reinforcing. It's a runaway carbon feedback loop. This is really scary stuff. And one of the scariest things about this are these notes over here on the right. You notice how there's this band of where we can do something to potentially mitigate these effects? Nothing. There's nothing we can do about that. There's no practical way to stop melting permafrost from pumping gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. We really need to stop carbon emissions before they get so high that all that permafrost melts and all that carbon locked up as frozen peat decomposes and turns into carbon dioxide. Some other really important ones, and I could spend an entire hour just talking about this table. increased risks of species extinction. This one is massive, okay? Biodiversity is life's insurance policy. We need biodiversity to live. It is what makes ecosystems function. Different species doing different things are why ecosystems can give us food and store carbon and protect us from floods and protect us from storms and cycle nitrogen, et cetera, all the things ecosystems do, okay? Climate change is going to drive tons of extinctions. It's going to redistribute and decrease low latitude fisheries yields. And at the same time, it's going to create a global trend for catching smaller fish. No more tuna and cod. We're talking anchovies and sardines, the biggest things we're going to be pulling out of the ocean. It's going to reduce the growth and survival of commercially viable shellfish and other things that have calciferous skeletons, right? So any kind of shellfish and bivalves, and that's due to ocean acidification. We're going to see major losses in marine biodiversity. We're going to see big negative impacts on crop yields, both the average yield and and we're going to see more variability in yield. So the average is going to go down and it's going to be more volatile. We're going to see more urban risks associated with water supply and water systems. We're going to see more urban risks associated with energy systems, like when a storm knocks out your power in the middle of winter and it freezes in your house in Texas. I mean, what are the odds of that happening? We're going to see more urban risks associated with housing. People's houses are going to wash away in a storm with sea level rise, and they're not going to have anywhere to live, which leads to the next one, which is displacement associated with extreme events. We're going to see more and more climate refugees in a big way, like on the same scale as wars. Well, what about wars? We're going to see more violent conflict because there's going to be major deterioration in people's quality of life and more struggle over resources, which, if human history is any measure of what's likely to happen in the future, and it is, people fight in those circumstances. That's when countries go to war over river water, which is already happening. We're going to see declining work productivity and increasing morbidity from exposure to heat waves. We're going to see reduced access to water in rural areas and urban poor areas due to both scarcity and more competition for water, and because water supplies are going to be not safe. That's a lot of things. And this is a part where I wish I could sort of turn around and say, but things look peachy in the Rio Grande Valley. I'm afraid not. I'm afraid the opposite is true. The Rio Grande Valley is at particularly high risk of climate change impacts. And there's a lot of reasons for this. First, we're seeing quite a few region-wide risks. We're going to see reduced freshwater availability, which is bad for a lot of reasons. Let me take a sip of water on that note. While I still can. This is coming from lower rainfall and actually a lot of other sources, and I'll mention that later. But lower rainfall upstream also means less catchment in the Rio Grande Valley watershed. Less water in the river, less rainfall around us means less water for people, less for agriculture, industry, and for our ecosystems, which are really important, as I'm going to tell you in another slide. We're going to see major impacts from hurricanes, flood and wind damage, and also impacts on our energy and economy and our food production and distribution. Heat waves and droughts are going to threaten our human life and health. A relatively large proportion of the population in the Rio Grande Valley is either elderly or very young, and those are the groups that are at the highest risk of heat stress. And we're going to see big heat waves. And we're going to see interruptions of our power systems, like in the winter storm and associated with hurricanes. Now, on top of those sort of general things, two of the reasons we're sensitive to climate change is because two of the pillars of our economy locally, regionally, are also at risk because of multiple aspects of climate change. The first is agriculture. Agriculture is a fundamental part of our economy and our culture in the Rio Grande Valley. And heat waves are going to affect yields. It's going to impact which crops we can grow, and it's going to affect the health of the workers in these places. Rainfall is going to affect the yield as well as how much we have to irrigate, which is going to change how much it costs to farm. And if freshwater availability goes down, we may not even be able to irrigate. even if we can afford it. There just may not be enough water, okay? And it's going to affect other things that you may not have thought about, like pollinator abundance, which also affects yields. Okay, anybody growing squashes, they're going to be in trouble if we don't have enough pollinators. The second really important industry that's another engine of our regional economy is ecotourism. People come from all over the world to watch birds and look at butterflies and go near shore and offshore fishing in the Rio Grande Valley. And those birds and butterflies and fish, they depend on our thorn scrub forests and our healthy coastal ecosystems. And these ecosystems are threatened by a lot of different aspects of climate change, the stuff we just talked about. Sea level rise is also a major threat to our coastal systems. And the community, like the ecosystems there, the plants and animals themselves, the people, the cities, the roads, and all the power infrastructure and energy infrastructure as well. And on top of that, not getting enough fresh water into the Laguna Madre is going to affect the productivity of our coastal systems. And I'm going to talk to you about that more in a little bit. And again, hurricanes, on top of all that, they have the very real potential to interrupt our ability to have tourists for years at a time if a major storm comes through and wipes out hotels and homes and B&B, Airbnb places, and there's no power and road access. It can also interrupt fisheries. So here, to kind of illustrate some of the sea level rise impacts, this is from the NOAA's sea level rise mapping tool, which you can find on the website shown at the bottom. This is looking at the areas in light blue are the land areas that will be inundated underwater, not at high tide, mean tide level, if we have a 3-foot increase in sea level rise. Now, this is the high end of our 100-year prediction. Okay, so we're probably not going to get this much by 2100 unless things get worse than the worst case scenario. But this is very realistic in 200 or 300 years, very realistic. And then if we look at 6 feet, ooh, that's looking even worse. That's starting to look really scary. It's not just the coastal wetlands around South Padre Island and in Laguna Atascosa and Bahia Grande that go underwater. There's a lot more land there that's underwater. And that's 2 meters. Now, that's sort of an intermediate climate scenario in a couple of centuries, but I care about what happens here in a few centuries, even though I'm going to be gone. That still matters to me, and it should matter to you. Here's Port Isabel. With 3 feet at the bottom, we see that a lot of their coastal systems are gone. Some of the new developments underwater, some roads are underwater. That's not good. That would seriously, very seriously disrupt Port Isabel. And again, then what about when a storm comes through? Here we are with 6. Yeah. This picture's worth 1,000 words. That's major disruption of this place. And then storms on top of that. Here's South Padre Island. Presently, 3 feet increase. All those wetlands they've been working to restore on the northern part, those are back underwater. Main Ocean Boulevard underwater, or South Padre Island Boulevard underwater. And if we get 2 meters of sea level rise, only the highest parts and places protected from flooding stand a chance. And then, of course, storms. Okay. Well, let me make you sadder. let me now tell you, and this is out of my comfort zone. This is not my area of expertise. So this is just some information I investigate and found on the economic and social impacts here. We've already talked about these a lot, right? Like I went through that list of impacts from the IPCC report, and that included a lot of economic and social things. But I want to give you some more hard numbers on some of these economic impacts. And so one statistic is particularly powerful to me, and maybe it will be to you. 4 of the key impacts alone from climate change: increases hurricane damage, okay, losses of real estate due to hurricanes and sea level rise, energy costs, and I'll tell you why in a minute, and increased costs of water four things that are going to happen because of climate change is going to begin to cost us 1.9 trillion with a T, trillion dollars annually. Not total over the rest of the century. We're going to be spending $2 trillion a year. That's almost 2% of our GDP every year by the end of the century to deal with these damages of climate change. Okay, and this is it broken down, sort of what it's going to be like in 2025, what it's going to be like in 2050, 2075, and 2100, right? And then both as a total amount of money and as a percentage of our GDP, and it's broken down by region, right? So we're, let's see, so well, hurricane damages, those are really going to only affect the Atlantic and Gulf Coast states. Oh yeah, that's us. Well, real estate losses, which is of course related to hurricane damage, that's going to be the Atlantic and Gulf Coast states. That's us too. Energy costs, energy sector costs, the Southeast and the Southwest. Well, that's also us. Yeah, we're going to be feeling that as we need to cool ourselves more and refrigerate more and do other, use power to hold ourselves together and pump water out of our first floors. And water costs in the Western states. Okay, well, that's not really us, except for the fact that our watershed of the Rio Grande is the Western states. So that's us too. We're going to feel this hard, right? So that first figure, $422 billion a year in economic losses caused by bigger Gulf Coast storms and Atlantic coast storms, right? So we have higher water temperatures. That plus other factors mean stronger storms, and this is compounded with sea level rise, which makes storm surge a really big deal, and voila, wind damage, flood damage, and erosion. $360 billion a year in damage and destroyed real estate, because we either have to build stuff to protect these areas, or we lose them. We lose them, or they're damaged severely, or they're damaged in a storm. Even if it's not underwater, the next time they might get flooded because of one of those more severe storms. $360 billion a year. $141 billion, oops, typo there, $141 billion a year in increased energy costs as we have to cool things more and refrigerate things more and buy all the equipment to do that, right? Have bigger air conditioning units and more cooling apparatus. $950 billion a year, almost $1 trillion a year to provide water to the driest areas and most water-stressed parts of the US. Less rainfall in those parts, especially at critical times of the year, that's going to mean major water shortages, critical water shortages, and that's going to be made worse by droughts and heat waves. So it's going to cost $1 trillion to put water where we need it because people live in places that are going to be absolutely water stressed. Okay. I really need to stick to my promise of talking about 8 years and 8 minutes here because I'm running out of the time. I want to leave 30 minutes for questions. So I'm going to tell you a case study now about coastal wetlands here in the Rio Grande Valley. This is my area of expertise. This is one of the major arms, one of the pillars of my own academic research programs. I study climate change in coastal wetlands here in South Texas and in fact across the entire US Gulf Coast. And so I'm talking about these areas, coastal wetlands. This is where the land meets the sea. This is intertidal wetlands, right? So the area between mean high tide and mean low tide are these low marsh areas, okay? And the high marsh is the areas that get flooded with like unusually high tides. But they're regularly influenced by the ocean. This is the kind of habitats I'm talking about. And I'm going to focus on functional groups because these four functional groups, grasses, graminoids, which includes rushes and sedges, mangrove trees, we have black mangroves here in South Texas, we have others in Florida and different species around the world. Succulents, things like Batis, maritima, saltwort, glasswort, sesuvium, they're sometimes actual cactuses, but they're very salt tolerant and they regulate their water levels by they resist salt stress by storing water, basically. And then unvegetated lands, which are also really important. A lot of animals feed in these areas, and some of these areas are pretty cool. I'm going to talk about these four functional groups because the same four functional groups that are present in South Texas are present all over the world. These are kind of the only four functional groups you get in coastal wetlands. You'll have different species of grasses, different kinds of mangroves, but wherever you go in the world, it's these 4 functional groups. So this is what they look like here in South Texas. You've got a little bit of Spartina grass. That's in, let's see, where's that? That's somewhere in Laguna Atascosa. Here's some black mangroves, a patch of succulents, and here, this is in Bahia Grande unit, some algae mats there. And just kind of close up look, you can see there's some oyster beds there. The black mangroves in South Texas don't get super tall. They usually not more than 3 or 4 meters. Lots of Batis maritima here. The darker green are young mangrove trees. And again, you can see the thickness of those mats on the ground there. And these mats are actually photosynthetic. Not all mudflats are, but they photosynthesize. There's algae and cyanobacteria in there and other things. And so they produce energy and things eat it and live there. And they can be really thick. Well, this is actually from Baffin Bay, but it can be like 2 inches thick. It's a pretty cool system. All right, so the big question in my research that's also obviously relevant here is how will climate change impact these coastal wetland ecosystems and coastal communities? And let me kind of start this by giving you the question of, what do these changes in wetlands and plant communities actually mean for people? Also often translated as, why should I care? Like what good are wetlands for me? What is this going to do? Well, the reason this matters, even if you don't care about these systems or the animals or plants that live there, if you're just completely selfish about it and you take a very nihilistic approach, it matters to you because the types and the amounts of plants govern the types and the amounts of ecosystem services that land provides. And I'll tell you what ecosystem services are next. So changes in plant community structure, that is how many of those different functional groups they are, how big they are, all that kind of thing, that changes the types and the amounts of goods and services that coastal wetlands provide to people. So here's some of those. Coastal wetlands are the poster child for ecosystem services. They have disproportionate value for how present they are. They protect us from storms. They protect us from erosion. They help remove waste, including nutrient pollution, from our water and based on their position in the watershed. They provide wildlife habitat, very important for us and our ecotourism. That's a whooping crane there. They provide fishery support, both for commercial and recreational fisheries. They help catch and clean water to improve our aquifers and our water supply. And they're huge for recreation and ecotourism. And I already talked about how that is a pillar of our regional economy. And they are incredible at storing carbon, which is one of the few ways we can not just reduce our emissions, but actually pull some of that carbon back out of the atmosphere and store it. Wetlands are one of the only ways we can realistically, and there are a lot of ways, but there are not that many, that we can realistically start drawing the carbon down out of the atmosphere and actually reducing atmospheric CO2 levels. They're better at this than tropical rainforests. And one of the reasons is because they store their carbon underground instead of keeping it in trees that can get burned or die when deforestation happens. Mangrove trees, salt marshes, seagrasses, they're all really good at it, but mangroves are particularly fabulous for this. Now, you may have a philosophical objection to putting a dollar amount on nature, but if you want to argue with economists, and I find myself having to do that often, then you need to be able to quantify this and kind of speak the same language. And so there's an entire subdiscipline in ecology about valuating ecosystem services, attaching dollar amounts to ecosystem services. And I won't get into how that's done, but you can see ecosystems provision food. They give us water and food and raw materials and medicine. They regulate our air quality, reduce climate disturbance. They protect us from storms and disasters. They yada, yada, yada. They prevent erosion. They help cycle nutrients. They provide nursery services, give us genetic diversity. All these things have dollar amounts. They can be calculated. And if we look at what wetlands do, it's almost $5 million per square kilometer per year. And that's doing nothing. That's just letting wetlands be wetlands and function and just do their own thing without any human interference. They do that much for us. And that's 10 times what a tropical rainforest can do. And tropical rainforests, no one's going to argue with you, are deeply valuable things. And our coastal wetlands, 10 times the ecosystem service value. All right, so to study what's happening with climate change and to connect it to connect these wetlands to climate and see what's going to happen to them, we collected data across the entire Gulf Coast. We had to get hot and dry areas and warm and cool and wet areas and warm and wet areas. So we sampled across the entire northern Gulf of Mexico. We positioned transects inside to capture gradients of salinity and tidal range. And then within a transect, we did transects that captured elevation gradients and things so that we could quantify distributions. And we got a whole lot of data, 10 estuaries, 70 transects, 1,000 plots. And we found what anybody who spent time in the coastal wetlands would see, and that's that they vary, right? You get more mangroves in red where you're warm. And as it gets cooler, mangroves don't tolerate frost, you get fewer and fewer mangroves as you go up the Texas coast. That's these here. And then by Galveston Bay, you barely have any mangroves. And then when you're in the cool, wet parts, it's a grass-dominated world. All right, so to kind of show you what this looks like in cartoon form. So this is one of the Mississippi sites. This is cool and wet, and it's grass-dominated. And almost the entire tidal range is vegetated. And eventually it gets into upland habitats, which are different grasses, and then into pine trees. In Mission Aransas, which is coastal bend of Texas, right, sort of middle Texas coast, which is pretty warm and pretty wet, kind of middle of the road, you start seeing mangroves because it's warm enough for mangroves to survive. You get succulents because there are some salty parts, and you have grasses sort of downhill of mangroves and in the uplands as well. And then in our neck of the woods in Laguna Madre, you have higher soil salinity. And so this middle area where you don't get regular tidal flushing and you get occasional dumping of water, that gets the saltiest. And so even no plants can survive there, not even succulents. They sort of exist at the edges. And it's only those algae mats that live there. And this is showing a very strong pattern. And you see this across the Gulf of Mexico, you see this across the world, of decreasing freshwater availability. That's what's really driving this pattern. We also found some really interesting patterns, and there's a lot of information here, but the take-home point is what this is showing you are relationships between graminoids and mangroves, and then succulents and unvegetated land, and their relationships to temperature and precipitation, okay? But the take-home point here, the most interesting finding about this is that the relationships are non-linear. That means there's this threshold value where big changes happen really fast. So at about, and this is the minimum temperature, and you can use other metrics for this, but there's this temperature, which basically is the tipping point for where grasses dominate to where mangroves dominate. And as the climate warms, more and more places are getting mangroves. And then in terms of rainfall, you get more veg with more rain. And as you get kind of below 800 millimeters of rainfall, which is about what South Texas is, you start to rapidly see an increase in unvegetated areas, okay? Before that, you see an increase in succulents, but after about 800, even succulents can't survive, and you start to get mudflats and algae mats. Height also goes up with temperature and rainfall, and that's a really big deal because height is important for things like stopping storm surge and protecting from hurricane wind and storing carbon and a lot of other, and providing biomass for food. You know, these are the foundation of the food web. All right, so we looked at those relationships, the equations that defined those nonlinear curves, those you know, these curves here. We combined them, and then we started sort of solving those equations to look at what the distribution of these different functional groups would be across a relevant range of temperatures and precipitations. And that's what this is, right? So you can do this individually for each of these functional groups, and no surprises, mangroves are most abundant where, so temperature on the x-axis, rainfall on the y-axis. Mangroves do best where it's warm and wet. Grasses do best where it's cool and wet. Succulents do best in the kind of mid to low rainfall range. And unvegetated land goes up exponentially as it gets drier and drier. And you can put all these things together and have this sort of like one-stop shop prediction of what kind of plants you'd expect to find in a coastal wetland based on its temperature and precipitation. And if you take any kind of part of the Gulf of Mexico, northern Gulf Coast, and you say, okay, I live in a place that has 1,000 millimeters of rainfall and negative 10 degrees minimum temperature. You can find that part on the map and then say, okay, I think there's going to be a balance between grasses and mangrove trees. There's going to be a lot of succulents around there. And there's going to be a little bit of patches of algae mats or something, but it's going to be pretty vegetated. And it'll be a place like Mission Aransas. And that's exactly what we see there. So these are good models. They actually reflect the reality of the world. And so then you can do another step where, and this is what we did, we broke down the Gulf of Mexico into climate regions. And then we looked within these rectangles and we looked at what the possible range of temperature and precipitation was within this rectangle over the last 30 years. And then we drew those bounding values on our map. So Central Texas, or just look at South Texas, right? It had a minimum temperature from -11 to -7, and it had a rainfall of 550 to 750 or something like that, okay? And then so that's bounded by there. And you can say, okay, well, any wetland in South Texas is going to be in this range. So it's going to be areas that might have a little bit of grass, but it's mostly mangrove, but there's going to be a lot of unvegetated land and also some succulents. Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly what we have. And you can do the same thing for height. And this big swing here is this temperature threshold where you go from grasses to mangroves. Again, really important for looking at ecosystem services. So then if you want to project what the future climate's going to be like, it's really easy because all you have to do is slide these rectangles around. You want to see what an area might look like 2 degrees warmer. You just nudge these rectangles 2 degrees to the right. You want to see what it looks like 10 degrees drier. You nudge them down 10%. And now you have a different prediction for South Texas or South Florida, or whatever. Okay. So in South Texas, I've got to say, these are actually very conservative models. Again, our chances of keeping temperature rise to 2 Celsius is looking less and less likely every day. We're much more likely to see something closer to 4, at least unless we can really turn things around. So we're looking at, with a 4-degree increase, Northeast Texas, that's Galveston Bay. I grew up fishing in Galveston Bay and it's a grassy world. These changes are not long-term. I mean, they're long-term for our human lives, but this by the end of the century, okay? Galveston Bay is gonna look like what Mission Aransas does now. It's gonna be a mix, mostly mangroves with a little bit of grass. That's gonna happen in my children's lifetime. That's a huge deal. That's a fundamental transformation in these ecosystems. This is very serious. This has a lot of implication. Now, this isn't all doom and gloom. Mangroves are great for lots of reasons. You know, I mentioned that mangroves store carbon really well. That's a positive. You know, maybe there's some hope in that, but it's a fundamental change and people aren't good at change. That's going to impact transportation. That's going to impact coastal habitats. It's going to affect the wildlife that live there. That's going to affect shipping. It's going to affect a lot of things. The same kind of pattern we're seeing in South Texas is also happening all over the world. The areas in red have that winter air temperature gradient where we're seeing a shift from grasses to mangroves. The blue areas are areas that are subject to that aridity gradient where we're seeing this transition from vegetated to unvegetated land. And the areas in purple are seeing both, like here in South Texas and the northern Mexico coast, both on the Atlantic and the Pacific side. There are other parts like Western Australia where that's the case. So this is a global phenomenon. And so what we see locally is important globally. And it's very exciting to be able to do that work here. So kind of to dig a little bit deeper into what is going to happen to coastal wetlands locally, and I'm running out of time. So I'm nearly at the end where I go over what we can do about it. So that'll be a good place to stop. But I'm going to fly through this last bit for the RGV. These coastal ecosystems, because of the role they play in ecotourism and in tourism in general, they're really valuable to us. And because of the role they play for wildlife further up the valley. Whatever happens to the rainfall here, other factors are going to basically mean that freshwater availability goes down. So with warmer means more evaporation, more transpiration. We have more municipal demand for water. The RGV is one of the fastest growing parts of the US. We're going to see more agricultural demand for water. And like I mentioned before, we're going to see fewer and larger rainfall events, which means that we're going to have more runoff. Less water is going to be absorbed by plants. And this might help Laguna Madre in some ways, and others it may not. It's really not clear at this point. And it's also going to increase water stress because there's going to be longer gaps between rainfall. So less freshwater availability. It's going down that climate graph. South Texas is going to be going deeper into the unvegetated zone. That's a big deal, maybe 20%. So this is what we sort of are. I showed you this figure before. This is what you see as you see a decrease in freshwater availability. The wettest places start to look like Middle Texas. Middle Texas starts to look like South Texas. But what would happen to South Texas, where we are? So here's an example of that. You can see that big area in the middle with the algae mats and no plants. That's this area in the middle here. That's my cartoon representation of this plot. I drew it in PowerPoint. All right. So what's going to happen here? Well, if we get drier and we get less freshwater rainfall, we're going to see that vegetation right on the coastline getting pinched because there's going to be a tighter range where the salt isn't too high. We might see a complete loss of cordgrass, which is a shame. We might see a complete loss of, well, we probably won't see a complete loss of oysters, but it's not going to help them. The upland vegetation is probably going to get pushed back. And essentially, we're going to see more of that middle range where it's algae mats or bare mudflats. Some species like that, most don't. Less vegetation. 20% less vegetation according to our climate models. Think about that. These are the plants that are the foundation of the food web. 20% less plants means 20% less bugs, less birds, less fish. That's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And let's not forget that the types and the amounts of plants govern the types and the amounts of ecosystem services that land provides. So less storm protection, less erosion reduction, all of these things. So this matters. This matters a lot. And it matters to us right here in our own backyard. Oops. Okay. I hope to be answering questions at this point, but I'm at this is the home stretch. And this is designed to be discussion. Okay. So there's really not much more in terms of slides, but I do want to go through a brief list of specific things you can do about it. I owe this to you. I've given you so much bad news. Here is the hope I can give you. We can do something about it. Don't feel depressed, overly depressed, too depressed, because there is hope for this. We can change our destiny. All right. So to consider what needs to happen, we need to consider carbon footprints. The average carbon footprint for a person that lives in the United States is 16 tons a year. Okay, the average person puts out 16 tons of carbon dioxide, or carbon equivalents, I should say, into the atmosphere. The global average is a quarter of that. It's 4 tons. That's right. Americans pollute 4 times more than the average. If we want to keep global warming to only 2 degrees Celsius, which is not great, but it's far better than worse. Think about those worst case scenarios versus best case scenarios and how much of a big difference that is. That's talking 7 meters of sea level rise instead of 1. Then we need to get our global average down to less than 2 tons of carbon per person per year. And we need to do that by 2050. That's a tall order. So what's it going to take to reduce your carbon footprint from 16 tons to only 2? That's an 88% reduction. Well, we need to think about where that carbon is coming from. And here are only 2 pie graphs, and they don't even agree, okay? And there's a dozen more. And depending on where you get your data and how you parse it out and whatever, you see different proportions, but it's the same groups. The big sources of our carbon footprints are transportation, cars and air travel, energy use, okay, especially heating and cooling our homes, food, what we're eating, where it comes from, and then goods and services. But that one's kind of, like, what are we buying and how is it produced? Like where do our clothes come from, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. All right. So here's some real specific stuff. First thing you can do and this is in more or less I shouldn't say more or less an order of total amount, but these are 5 key things we need to do. And I'm starting with just personal action to reduce our carbon footprints. The first thing is to drive less any way you can. So walk or bike where it's feasible. And I've put these little icons here to point out with a little heart when it has health benefits associated with it, a dollar sign when it has financial benefits, when it saves you money, and people icon to show when there are social benefits. Okay, so we're thinking economically, socially, and physically here. So walking and biking saves you money, gets you good exercise. Carpooling more saves you money, make more friends, get to better know your neighbor. Plan ahead, make fewer trips. Avoid going unnecessarily. Don't go if you don't have to. One of the big benefits of COVID was showing the world that, man, we can teleconference a lot more than we thought. I really hope we don't lose that. I hope we reduce how much we drive and we stick to this teleconference approach as much as we can. And to choose a fuel efficient vehicle, that's going to save you money too, right? So don't encourage you to get the biggest truck and roll coal like the guy in this picture is doing. You know, you may not be able to afford an electric vehicle, but you can still get a more fuel efficient car. And here's some data that supports this, right? The difference between in emissions between large cars, medium cars, and electric cars, and then versus small stuff is pretty big. And this, well, I'm going to show you a figure later on that also includes public transport. The next big thing you can do is fly less. This is hard. Some of us have to travel, okay? And there's not always a way around this. So, but cut it down where you can. Avoid unnecessary travel. Again, teleconference if you can. Drive where it's feasible. And again, and actually the calculus for this depends on your car. If you're driving an F-350 and rolling coal, it's probably better to fly. But if you have an efficient car, it's better to drive, right? Here's one, minimize your connecting flights. So much of the fuel used by an airplane happens during takeoff and landing that those connecting flights make the carbon footprint of your travel go up a ton. Now, this doesn't save you money. That costs you money to avoid the connecting flights, but it really makes a big difference for carbon emissions. And then, do your best to plan ahead and make fewer trips. If you can do one longer trip instead of 2 shorter trips, that's great. That'll help you fly less. And so here's some figures and data to back this up. Looking at how much comes out from one. Sorry, this is on a per kilometer traveled. Domestic flights are bad, long haul flights are bad. Some of these are from secondary effects of like nitrous oxide emissions in high atmosphere. And then cars versus public transport, right? Like buses and trains are better than cars, no matter how efficient it is. And then here's another comparison of more varieties of transportation, including some public transport. Okay, another really important thing we can do is reduce our energy consumption. And one of the main places where we consume energy is at home. And if I could sort of point at 2 of the appliances that are the most guilty, it's your air conditioning unit and your dryer. Those are the 2 machines in your house. More probably in your oven, depending on your oven and whether it's gas, of course. They are the main draws of your electricity, right? So avoid air conditioning your house. Set your thermostat higher in the summer and lower in the winter. And I'm so proud of my wife for convincing me to bear with setting our thermostat at 83. It makes me feel like every day I suffer and sweat. I feel like I'm helping. I'm practicing what I preach here. All right. Hang your clothes up to dry. That's some exercise. I'm ashamed that it was only in the last few weeks that I got my wife, who is my better guiding angel, to convince me that we needed to do this. And so we have clothesline out, and I encourage you to do that because that dryer is a big culprit. Insulate your home better. That way, you don't have to run your air conditioning as much, and it's more comfortable, right? It'll stay cooler longer. I won't get up to 83 quite so fast in the summertime. I'll have more hours in the morning before it becomes unpleasant, right? And I have a figure here that shows that it's cost effective to do this, to improve the heat buffering capacity of your house. Turn down your water heater. If you aren't showering on the hottest setting, you don't need to set your water heater so high, and you're just wasting the energy to heat it more than you actually want it heated. There's something like 10% of consumer electronic energy use comes from devices that are off. So if you can, unplug them, and generally, try to reduce your appliance use. Hand washing dishes is good. Only doing loads of laundry when it's full, that's better than just running the washing machine anytime you have 5 or 6 things that need washing. And here's again data to back this up, looking at where most of the household energy consumption comes from. Most of it's this is not a South Texas flavor. It's cooling. That's where we spend most of our stuff. But climate regulation is the key thing, and then heating water, running appliances. It adds up. It's a lot. Now, in addition to reducing your energy consumption at home, and then here's just looking at like the payback times for different insulating technologies. Double glazing costs a lot and it takes a long time to recoup that saving, but some of these things are super cost effective. Like everybody should have a jacket on their water heater. And I'm just remembering that I've been meaning to put one on mine for like 5 years and I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to. This is the motivation I need to make sure I actually do it. All right, now, in addition to cutting your consumption, it's also super important to try to transition the source of your energy. Okay, so where your energy comes from is as important as how much energy you use. And this is not always easy. Okay, so if you can, you can do this today. Go home, go to powertochoose.org, and look at all the different options of energy providers in your area. And you may be surprised that there are going to be some, hopefully, that offer entirely renewable energy. You can buy pure Texas wind power, as opposed to getting it from some other energy company that burns coal. Okay, now I know our grid is more complex than that, and there's not a guarantee that you're always going to be able to be buying wind generated electricity. But this is important. And if you can, incorporate on-site generation. A solar roof is the best, the obvious example here, but they're expensive. Not everybody can afford to do that. We're looking at doing it ourselves, and it's pricey. It's cost prohibitive for us right now. But even just putting a few panels out can be helpful. And if you can put a panel that runs appliances that you normally use, or like run something outside, like if you have lamps outside and you make them solar powered, that's great. That cuts down, and that can often save you money. And then wherever you can, whatever energy plan you choose, whatever way you decide to heat your home and whatever, use cleaner fuels as much as you can. So renewable sources are better than gas. Gas is cleaner than oil, and oil is cleaner than coal. And not all oils are created equal, but generally that's how it works. So choose cleaner sources of energy. All right, now here's one that you may or may not surprise you. And this one is very important and often doesn't get a lot of play because people don't like to think about the effect that what they eat is having on the atmosphere and on the planet. But to give you the short and sweet of how your food affects climate, if you really want to reduce your carbon footprint, eat less meat. Buying local is also important, but it is way less important. Scientifically, data-driven, it is not as big of a factor as what you eat. Eating less meat has a bigger effect. Particularly bad offenders are beef and lamb. They use a ton of, the amount of carbon needed to make them and the amount of water needed to make them is super high compared to other things. So try to minimize your beef and lamb, reduce your pork, dairy, chicken, and fish. And of course, vegans best, vegetarians almost as good. But that's a step that most people aren't ready to make. So I encourage you to just take a step, go a little bit, start small, work your way up to it. Try meatless Mondays. Try just eating chicken instead of beef 2 times a week. The more you do it, you'll realize there's benefits to it. And doing all those things, eating lower in the food chain is kind of like a good general rule. like eating, for example, eating seaweed is far better than eating sardines, which is a herbivore, which is better than eating tuna, which is like a tiger of the ocean. Like they're like top carnivores, right? And you should also avoid anything that's produced unsustainably. So that includes plant-based stuff, not just animal-based stuff. So palm oil is often really bad for rainforests, same with coffee, right? So try and get shade-grown, fair trade coffee if you can. You can get palm oil that's sustainably farmed, but all the things that include palm oil, not necessarily. And chocolate too. There's a lot of danger. Chocolate, and I could include vanilla as well. And of course, food miles are important. So buy locally sourced foods where you can to reduce your food miles. And those are the big ones, right? So here's data to prevent this. And I'll point out, plant-based diets are a really big deal. And I'm vegan 95% of the time. I have a kind of complex food ethic. My wife is a strict vegan. She's, like I said, she's a better person than me. And not for not for lots of reasons, not just for that reason. Eating a plant-based diet is good for you. I mean, proven health benefits. And it's good for the environment, proven climate benefits. And of course, it's good for both domestic and wild animals. So I encourage you to eat a more plant-based diet, even if you aren't ready to give up meat. So looking at this, just kind of where the carbon comes from in our diets, it's the meat. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying. Cutting meat is the first and most important thing to have a lower ecological impact from what you consume. And it's kind of complicated, right? So I include this one to point out that cheese is a very big offender because most of it comes from cows, and cows are so bad, right? They're not as bad as beef cows, but the ecological impacts of cheese are really high. And there are some plants that have really big carbon footprints. Chocolate and coffee are pretty bad and pretty big, but I've got to say here, you don't eat pounds of chocolate. You don't eat pounds of coffee, right? In terms of your daily consumption, this is a high impact, but like the impact per serving is still pretty low. But think about these plant-based foods too. Where they come from matters. All right, so that's it. This is the end. And I want to leave you with a few ideas. And I want to tell you that being the change you want to see in the world, living virtuously, driving less, flying less, eating less meat, using less energy at home, converting to renewable sources of energy, those are all important, but they're not all of the problem, because we have to make societal changes to deal with this, right? So the other things you and I can do today to start having an effect on climate change is to spread the word, to get the word out. Tell people about this. Tell people what you learned today. Tell people you care. Don't go and be preachy and say like, you need to be a vegan, because you don't get people to change their behavior that way. But you go and you tell them, man, I'm concerned about sea level rise. I'm worried about South Padre Island being underwater in 100 years. And you know what? For that reason, I decided to pay a little bit more and switch to renewable based energy company. And you can be a good example, and that's more likely to get people to see that there's merit to doing that. If they understand why it's such a big deal, they're more likely to change their behavior in response, rather than going and pointing your finger at them and telling them that you're killing the planet and you need to do better. Even if that's true, that's not always the best way, very seldom the best way to get people to come around. So just spread the word and go vote. Be an actively engaged part of our political process. Don't just vote, go get people registered to vote. Drive them to the polling place. Tell them what issues are important to you. Tell your represented officials what issues are important to you. Schedule a call with your senator and your congressman as much as you can. Lobby. Tell people about it. There's important legislation out there. So promote and support candidates who are pro-climate, and support and promote legislation that's good for the climate. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividends Act was recently introduced to the House of Representatives, and it creates a fee on carbon, which means that polluters have to pay for some of those external climate impacts that they're currently pushing on us. And instead, they have to pay a fee for it. And that fee gets collected and it gets sent back out to every American as a dividend, as a stimulus. And that is going to not only make the polluters pay, it's going to help people vote with their dollar and support good causes. All right. So get involved in politics beyond voting. Now, I leave you with the idea of where we are with the bigger social constructs, governments and corporations. And you might have heard the quote, and this came from a report, and I've read the whole report. And this was the headline from like The Guardian not long ago. And this is now a statistic that's often bandied about. And the statistic is just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. Now, that's a complicated thing, and people who've read the report and who might be quick to defend corporations will say, well, that 71% includes what's considered phase 1 and phase 3 carbon emissions, right? So this includes things like ExxonMobil is like number 3 in the world, not a big surprise. But something like 70% of ExxonMobil's carbon emissions are considered phase 3 emissions, which means it's the burning of the gas after they've sold it, right? So a quarter of their emissions are actually finding and extracting and processing the oil to produce gasoline. The other 3/4 are what happens when that gasoline is burned by you and me. So they say, oh, don't blame the corporations. You're as much to blame. You, the consumer, are as much to blame because you're burning gasoline. So who's right? It's actually more complex than that, because I've got to ask you, why is that our only option? Why do we still have to burn gasoline? Why is not using gas not a viable option for most of America and much of the world? Why isn't there more public transportation? Why can't we buy certain things that are produced sustainably? Because the only ones that produce it don't do it sustainably. This is not this. I'll be clear. It is very much the fault of corporations and governments that have not created sustainable methods. If we need to do a better job of forcing them to give us these options. And sometimes that means vote with your dollar. And that's a very flawed concept, because the idea of voting with your dollar means that people who have more dollars have more votes. And sadly, history says that's actually very true, but it shouldn't be. Okay. But the idea that we can make a choice, we have to influence these companies and say, we're not okay with the way you do business. Do everything we can. And we may be a small voice, but that's why we got to get the word out. We've got to convince more people, because it's only through collective action that we can cause governments and corporations to change their behavior, because we have to change and they have to change if we're going to come close to cutting our carbon footprints by 88%. But we can do it. It's a major task before us, but this is a life or death fight. It is a long drawn out multi-generation life or death fight. And in the near term, it's a fight for our way of life and our well-being. You know, we've gone to wars to defend our American way of life. Part of the tragedy of this is that American way of life is the fundamental cause of so much of this climate change. But we can and must fight for our well-being by acting to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So be informed consumers, get the word out, tell your friends, and try to follow as much as you can the specific advice we talked about today. So here's my acknowledgments to all the people that contributed to the data and research, and that's it. And I went way over. Thank you all for your patience. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm open for questions. I'm happy to answer as many questions as I can. I'm willing to go longer. If people do want to ask me questions for 30 minutes, I'm more than happy to field questions for that long. Thanks. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, Dr. Gabler. We are still live, and yes, it is almost 7, but we did get a lot of questions.
Yeah, okay.
And, amongst ourselves, we were very much into your talk. So even we were, it was kind of hard to keep track of the questions. But one of the first ones that I want you to clarify, and I did see it in the comments, is if you could briefly clarify the difference between global warming and climate change.
Sure. So global warming is one part of climate change. So we say climate change because there's so much else happening. There's changes in precipitation, there's changes in storm intensity, there's changes in the ice cycle. You know, it's a lot of different stuff. So global warming is one part of climate change, but climate change is global warming plus a bunch of other stuff. Great question.
Great, thank you. And then another one that we saw a few times, this one specifically is from Karen Alanis, and she wants to know do you think Elon Musk's plans in the RGV will affect wildlife and climate change?
Yes, I do. Full disclosure, and this is really kind of ironic, I'm actually contracted by SpaceX to survey the environment around the launch site at Boca Chica Beach. That was part of their permit process, was they had to monitor those coastal wetland habitats that are critical habitat for 2 endangered bird species, piping plovers and red knots. So anyway, so I've actually been surveying the habitats around the launch pad, and the immediate effects of their emissions and things hasn't really changed the habitats. But when rocket parts land on things, you know, when stuff blows up and fires happen, that obviously affects those areas. That's not really been it. But the biggest change has been when they just paved over wetlands and poured concrete on habitat. But that happens everywhere. That happens all over the place. But as far then as space exploration goes, shooting rockets into the air uses a lot of fossil fuels, right? And this is something I kind of have two minds about. Like I'm a scientist. I'm a space nerd. I like science fiction. I like the idea of exploring space and being able to travel outside our planet and maybe one day out into other star systems and beyond. Who knows what the future holds? But there's a major carbon price tag to that. And if I think about if we thought of carbon emissions as money, like how we spend our emissions, I sort of feel like space exploration is worth it, you know, like, because launching a rocket is a ton of carbon. But if you think about it, it's also sort of like tens of thousands of cars driving for a month. So if we just improved fuel standards a little bit, it would be a much bigger thing. So, I mean, it's massive compared to you and me, but it's also kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the global carbon emissions. So what I really like to see is SpaceX work hard to be carbon neutral and work hard to sequester the carbon they put in the atmosphere from their launches. That would really impress me and give them the environmental chops they like to claim they have. Great question.
Great, thank you. This next one is from Fabian Garcia. And you had briefly touched on this, but he asked that we've noticed a lot of jobs may be performed at home. Would working from home set up a trend to lower the carbon footprint, and should we advocate for this?
Absolutely. I mean, the more we can do remotely, anything to stay off the roads, that's great. And there's a lot of costs to society from more car traffic. There's also public health issues, there's public safety issues, there's infrastructure costs. You know, I mean, if we can do things with technology, then we should. And it's a very legitimate way to reduce our carbon outputs. So why not? I think every little bit helps, and we need to do everything we can. That'd be a great thing. Good question. I'm going fast because I want to answer as many as I can in the 7 minutes.
Oh no, don't worry. There, a lot of them you did answer, so I'm trying to find
okay, good.
more of that.
That's the one
kind
good
of
thing
stuck
about
out.
talking so much is I accidentally answer questions sometimes as I go.
This one is a good, I think you had touched on it briefly, but do you know about our demographic down here? Like in the RGV, are we typically aware of climate change and how it affects our daily life?
Ah, yeah. No, so I've lived in the valley for 6 years now. I love it here, and we're not going anywhere. And I have a relatively biased snapshot of RGV awareness because I'm a professor. So I'm talking to students, and college students are disproportionately well informed compared to the average citizen. My stance, like among the students I interact with, they're very well informed. And let me tell you this, and I want to say this, and I'm glad I'm able to say this before it's too much past 7, but I gave a pretty dark talk with a lot of bad news. And if I have to say, one of the things that gives me the most hope is my students. The people I talk to, the students that I see coming in, I think if I were to compare them, they are so much more aware, they're so much more woke to the reality of the world and what needs to happen to turn things around than talking to my parents or anyone in their generation. Like there has been a paradigm shift in our awareness of the environment and our value of the environment. And it gives me tremendous hope. And I'm telling you, all the students listening today, you are the answer. You are the future. You are the solution to this. It will be your power and your place to really turn this around in the coming decades. So do it, please. You're the only one who can. But so I wish I could tell you more whether the rest of the RGV shares that same kind of environmental awareness. I think we are pretty good. The fact that we have such a strong agricultural tradition in the valley means that we're a people that's more intimately connected to the earth and the cycles of the earth and the whims of nature and the impacts of bad weather and good weather. And it makes us more in tune than the average group of people anywhere else in the US. So I don't have any data to support that, but I believe that to be the case. And I've got to say that, again, the students I interact with in the Valley are tremendous. So I wish I had that answer. Great question.
A great answer. I'm sorry if you can hear my cat. I tried to keep him out as much as I
had planes and birds, and my dogs were barking for a while. And
we were asking also just within us, the birds, is it just your window open or?
Oh, I'm outside. I'm on my deck.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Were there a lot of bird sounds? There usually are.
Yes, it was very comforting. So another question that they had asked is, they asked, what can we do to help at a community level, such as environmental groups? So if you have any environmental groups that you can recommend, and that was from Angelica Lopez Bocanegra.
That's a great question. There are a lot of environmental groups around, like some of the big national ones are active in the area, like Defenders of Wildlife have a chapter here. Sierra Club has a local chapter. There are more local things related to kind of like, there are some really active Texas master naturalist groups, and they do some tremendous work. I love I've worked with them as much as I can. So they actually get trained and do service work related to ecological restoration and other habitat improvements. Those are really good groups to work with. And then there's, like, I wish I could tell you some just sort of local groups, apart from the ones on campus. There are campus environmental groups and campus groups affiliated with sustainable food production and things. I'm sure there are a lot, but apart from kind of like the known names of Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, the Defenders of Wildlife, I wish I could tell you more, but look around. Ask people in one of those groups, and they can probably give you some connections. But getting into those groups, getting involved in those groups, that is a tremendous way to make an impact and to spread the awareness of this issue and start making concrete changes. So I'm glad someone asked that. Thank you very much for that question.
And we were glad to hear about pushing to vote, because as scientists, typically they don't see us in that light, that we get involved in politics. So it is really important that you brought that to attention. And that is important. As far as activism, I know that we are involved with Citizens Climate Lobby, so that's another good group if anybody is interested with that.
Full
As far-
disclosure, that's how I got to know Elizabeth, and I've got to give her credit for bringing me into the lobby game. So thank you, Elizabeth. I feel like I'm doing good work with that, and I have you to thank.
I'm sorry. Sorry, but he's pretty bad. But I'm trying to see if there's anything else that really stuck out to me. Some people were asking about like bacteria and
Like
how that
harmful
would get
algal blooms kind of bacteria, or
they were
as
asking
a-
about archaea bacteria,
okay.
but I think you had touched on that since it's so close to the coast.
What archaebacteria in what context? Like as a means to sequester carbon, or as something that lives in those algae mats?
They had just mentioned archaea bacteria in general.
Okay. Well, if you think about the microorganisms that play important roles in these coastal systems, there's like in those algae mats, there's a lot of cool stuff. Archaebacteria, and in fact, all bacteria and single-celled microbial stuff, they play important roles in soil processes that are huge for carbon sequestration. Like whether something gets decomposed or whether it gets stored has to do with bacteria and fungus more than anything else. So they're of the utmost importance, but it's not strictly archaebacteria. Like I said, it's a whole group of microbes. Another thing that's important and connected to climate change are the microorganisms that are responsible for harmful algal blooms, like toxic blooms of algae, which is usually more of a eutrophication thing, which is related to nutrient pollution, which is another global change, but not necessarily climate related. And also things like dinoflagellates and other small organisms that are responsible for like red and brown tides that are public health risks in the coastal waters. A lot of those blooms and tide events, like red and brown tide events, are connected to climate, and warming waters will exacerbate them and make them more common. So glad if I'm not sure if that's the angle you were asking about, but it bears mentioning. So thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Someone made a comment that maybe my cat was hearing your birds, and that's why he decided to show
I'll
up.
get my dog, and then we'll have a whole food web kind of situation going on, and we'll have to get a horse. And
well, I think that's most of the questions that were not covered. As someone had asked also about the media, if the media does have a play in, I guess, if what we know about.
Yeah, absolutely. So the media can be our good journalism is one of the most important parts of our society, and the media is imperfect, like all human institutions are, but for the most part, they are doing a good job of spreading the word. They could do a better job. They could cover things that are really important. Different media that's not independent, media that has profit margins in mind, may be reluctant to talk about how important it is to cut down eating meat if their major commercial sponsors are Tyson and Swanson and all these like meat farmers, So I wish there was a bigger role of public media and independent journalism in our discourse. It has a role, but it doesn't have as broad of an audience as I wish it would. But if this is coming from a student journalist or a communications major, I encourage you to be the best journalist you can be, because it is such an important part. Our founding fathers knew how important a free press was, and how the third pillar of society. A press is necessary for a functioning democracy, and without a good media to tell people about how important these issues are, and how we can address these and what the real problems, where they lie. Now, we won't ever be able to garner the kind of mass popular support we need to make these fundamental societal shifts. So the media plays a absolutely central role in this. And if the media isn't doing as well as we think it should, we need to act to change that.
That's a great point. I think that's all that we have as far for questions, and we are 10 minutes over. So
Those were great questions, and thank you all for staying late.
yeah, we want to thank everyone that was able to attend. Thank you for all of your questions, your comments. We noticed that you were very engaged, so we know that this talk was, I guess, very knowledgeable. And so we will send you out a survey. If you have any topics that you would like to see us bring forward, feel free to let us know, and then we can try and arrange that for you. But that's going to be it for today. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you all have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you all very much.